Oh, je t'aime. Ouais. Oh. Oh, hi! How are you doing today? This video is scheduled to be dropped on December 30th, which means this is the season to drink Home Alone. That's basically Friday for me. But it's also Wednesday, which means it's time to get crafty with me. Qu'est-ce que tu veux, toi? Oui. Tu veux un bisou? I decided to make a Christmas special this week and show you how I made this vintage dress using a Christmas cotton print from Fabricville and a vintage pattern from Butterick. It's number 9969. So I'm making this model here with the collar, and there's a midriff section, the sleeve, and a mid-length pencil skirt. It's undated, but I can only assume it's from the late 50s. I got a similar pattern here. This one's from Simplicity. It's 2951. And this one is also undated. But just looking at the way they're cut and also looking at their hairstyles, this to me looks late 50s or maybe at the very latest early 60s. These are pretty much the same bodice, except one has a V-neck and a collar and one doesn't. But apart from that, they're pretty much the same. I think this is pretty much it, so without further ado, let us get to work!
Before I start cutting into my quite expensive Christmas cotton print, let me make a quick mock-up. This allows me to give my bodice a better fit, but also to check if there are any mistakes or defects on the original pattern tracing. This time, I'm making my mock-up out of a pair of old bed sheets. I'm simply doing the bodice and the skirt without any collar or facing, or without finishing my raw edges. Since I could not be bothered to insert a zipper into a mock-up, I've pinned myself into it. The fit looks perfect in the front, but it was a bit too loose at the sides. There was 5/8 of an inch of extra room on each side of the side seams, just under the armhole to be exact, but the waist seemed just fine. And the rest of the fit seemed just perfect. I was a bit skeptical at first with that kind of separate midriff pattern, but wow, that bodice! Chef's kiss. Taking this and other minor defects into account, I retraced the bodice and the midriff pattern pieces on craft paper, labeling them with the information written on the original. As a personal preference, I decided to not include the seam allowances. I now am ready to start cutting into my Christmas print, and lots of pieces have to be cut on a fold, so I'm watching out for that. For the bodice pieces, which were both cut on the fold, I first marked all my seam lines on one side with the tailor's chalk. Then I traced these same lines with the tracing wheel, which allowed me to trace them on the other side of the fold with the tailor's chalk again. I then traced my darts with the tracing wheel, which enabled me to trace them all by chalk. And the midriff pieces here were traced with the same techniques, except there were no darts. Next, the skirt panels. The front one needs to be cut along a fold, so it'll be doubled. Both skirt panels need a 3-inch seam allowance on the bottom hem, as per the pattern instructions. My other dress pieces are a collar, a sleeve ×2, a front neck facing ×2, a back neck facing cut along a fold. The collar and the midriff sections need to be doubled, but I had just enough fashion fabric for the outer layer, so off camera I cut my inner layers into a plain green cotton that vaguely matches with the Christmas print. Since it's not going to be visible, the match doesn't have to be 100% perfect. When I'm cutting out my bodice and midriff pieces, I'm making sure to keep myself enough seam allowances. Alright, so the pattern instructions start with the skirt back, and they have me stitch the center back seam and back edges of the extension, and then stitch the darts together and press them towards the center, baste through the medium dots for the pleat, clip back to the medium dot at the top of the extension, press the seam open above the extension, and press the pleat towards the left back. So I'm doing the center back seam now, and then I'm doing the darts. I've traced a line between the medium dots next to the extension, and I'm using a needle and some thread, and I'm basting that line as per the pattern instructions. I'm clipping the extension top as directed, then I can press that whole piece. The top center back seam is pressed open, the darts are pressed towards the center, and the extension is pressed towards the left of the garment. I decided to finish these seam allowances by edge stitching them, which means simply pressing them inwards so the raw edges will be hidden. Then, taking a needle and some thread and giving them a quick running stitch. The instruction for my front panel then told me to form the pleats by bringing the small dots together and baste this in place, and then to stitch this piece at the upper edge. This will secure the pleats in place as I worked on the rest of the garment. The instructions had me work on the side seams next, leaving the left side open above the notches for a placket that will accommodate a zipper later on. The pattern doesn't specify how I should finish the seam allowances, so I opted to fell them towards the front. Next, the instructions had me machine sew all the bodice darts before attaching the shoulder seams. I went ahead and I felled those seams as well off camera to avoid being too redundant. The next step in the instructions says to baste interfacing to the inside of one section of the collar. However, I have fusible interfacing on hand, so I decided to double interface the section that's made of plain green cotton, not the fashion one. This deviates from the instructions a bit, and it is what it is. To put the collar together according to the instructions, I had to sew it on this outer edge, right sides facing each other. And to turn it properly, I had to A. Trim the seam allowances to about 1/4 inch, and then B. Clip the remainder every 5/8 of an inch or so. This allowed me to flip the collar right side out and give it a good press. As a personal preference, I'm also top stitching it. My collar is all prepped and ready to be sewn to the garment now, so I've pinned it to the neck opening, matching center fronts as well as the shoulder seam lines. I'm gonna go ahead and hand baste, then machine stitch that bit and be right back. The next step in the instructions tell me to put the neck facings together by stitching them at the center front and the shoulder seams, as well as to turn the outer edge in. I'm doing both by hand before giving that hand-basted neckline one more machine stitching to make sure that the facings stay really secure. Before I flip my facings to the inside of the garment, I gotta trim and clip its seam allowances, especially at the center front, where I'll even carve out as much of the bulk as I can. I'm also clipping every 5/8 of an inch all around. Off camera, I went ahead and I've pinned the facings to the inside of the garment, and I'm now taking it to the sewing machine where I'll top stitch this whole neck edge all around, being extra careful for the machine needle not to bite into the collar layers. To make absolutely sure that the neck facings stay inside the garment, I'm tacking them with a few whip stitches here and there, especially around the seam lines. Alright, my next order of business, the sleeves. According to the original pattern instructions, the next step would be to sew the side seams before setting the sleeves in. However, I find that setting sleeves on the loose arm's eye before the side seams are sewn is much easier. I've stitched the sleeve darts and then pressed them towards the bottom. Since I've modified the bodice pattern but not the sleeve, I know that the sleeve doesn't exactly fit into the arm's eye. It's too large actually. My trick is to gather the excess sleeve into a box pleat that will lay on top of the shoulder across the shoulder seam. To do that, I'm first matching the big dot on my sleeve to the shoulder seam, right sides facing each other, and securing it in place with a single stitch. I'm then matching the underarms and I'm pinning it taut with the bodice arm's eye all the way up to that center shoulder point, where I'm ending up with a little flap of fabric left over. I'm folding this little flap of fabric away from the shoulder point. I'm doing exactly the same thing on the other side, and when I'm sure everything looks good, I'm basting it by hand, sewing it by machine, and finishing the raw edges. I'm ready for my side seams now. I'm keeping one side open for the zipper placket, sewing only the sleeve and making sure that the open side is the same as the skirt's open side. The seam allowances on the closed side may be finished however you choose. I chose to fell them by hand as it's my favorite finishing. Alright, we're very close to the finishing line now, with only a few things left to do. Next is attaching the bodice to the skirt, linking them with the midriff sections. There are two main midriff sections, one for the inside and one for the outside. Both are made of a front and a back piece. I'm deviating a bit from the instructions here by interfacing the inside layer instead of the outside one. Once the inside back and front midriff sections are both interfaced, I can sew them together at one side seam, making sure the unsewn side matches with the open bodice and skirt sides. I'm doing the same with the outer fashion layer. The outer midriff section needs to be basted to the bodice, right sides facing each other. The inner midriff section, the one that's made of interfaced plain grain cotton, is basted the same way but on the inside of the garment. I'm making sure the side seams as well as the zipper placket match as best as possible. Then I'm machine stitching everything together. This gives me a complete bodice minus a zipper and a skirt that I'm ready to attach together. To do that, I'm taking the inner layer, that's the one with interfacing. I'm folding the seam allowances inwards towards the interfacing, and I'm stitching it all around with a running stitch. This will keep the fold in place while I baste and machine stitch the outer layer with the skirt, right sides facing each other at the waistline. To finish my waistline and hide all the raw edges, I'm going inside the garment and I'm bringing that pre-stitched fold to the waistline, pinning it in place and then whip stitching it. Both midriff sections are now installed and I'm ready to put on a zipper. If you don't know how to install a zipper, there should be a video suggestion appearing right up here. Moving on to my last few finishings now. I'm cleaning my sleeve/side seam allowances over the zipper, felling them like I did with most of my other seams. I'm also cutting and pressing 2 fabric strips from my fashion fabric, with the intent of using those as a way to hide the raw edges around the zipper tape. They were really too short to be folded and felled, so I'm simply whip stitching a strip along each side of the zipper tape, hiding all the raw edges underneath. There's no cuff on that sleeve, just about 5/8 of an inch of seam allowances, so I'm making a very short hem. I'm folding in about a 1/4 inch, sewing it with a running stitch, and then I'm folding that edge again by a 1/4 inch, which I'll secure in place with a regular and discreet whip stitch. Try to catch just a couple fibers if you can. The very last step is to hem the skirt. The pattern instructions had me put a 3 inches seam allowance, so I'm first pinning that inwards and I'm giving it a good press. You need to hide that raw edge underneath a piece of ribbon or bias tape. In my case, I used this 1-inch ribbon that I had in stock. And voila! A new vintage dress made with the Butterick 9969 sewing pattern, which I can only assume is from the late 50s. With its color and its fun Christmas fabric, it's so gosh darn cute! I look like a Christmas present. This was a very fun project to make too. And for the first time in a long time, I managed to do the whole garment without having to rip some seams and start over. I'm so happy with the results. I'd like to thank you so much for watching and to wish you a happy belated Christmas as well as a good new year. In the meantime, drink plenty of water, don't drink too much eggnog and drive, and please send a card to your grandparents, unless they're jerks. I will see you next Wednesday. Bye!